We see education today in the Philippines as a cornerstone of national development, with the government and various stakeholders recognizing its vital role in shaping the country's future. Different progresses and advancements in education, whether it be on the philosophies or in its social-cultural aspect, has made it what it is today. This same reason also opens the discussions of whether the same processes and advancements also lead to the negative connotations of education in the current time. In line with this, we will discuss the specific adjustments that happened in history and how it shaped our education today. One prominent educational thinker emerged with regards to our outlook with education is Henry Giroux. Henry Giroux, also known as Henry Armand Giroux, is an American scholar and cultural critic. Being one of the founders of critical pedagogy in the United States, he is best known for his pioneering works in public pedagogy, cultural studies, youth studies, higher education, media studies, and critical theory. In one of his research entitled Cultural Studies, Public Pedagogy, and the Responsibility of Intellectuals, Giroux highlighted how cultural studies, although shadowed by globalization and political economy, are still critically important for understanding and transforming society. Many theorists and educators during his time reduced pedagogy to just classroom instruction. However, he emphasizes that culture itself educates us. Education happens everywhere. This idea of education being present in everyday life is the main point of his idea of critical pedagogy.
What if education wasn't just about learning facts, but about questioning the world around you? That's exactly what critical pedagogy is about. And Henry Giroux wasn't the only one who thought so. Let's look at three other thinkers who shaped the way we see education today. First, we have Paulo Freire, one of the most famous voices in critical pedagogy. In his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he argued that traditional education treats students like empty containers. He called this the banking model of education. Teachers deposit information, and students are expected to memorize and repeat it. But Freire believed real learning happens when students engage, question, and even challenge what they're taught. Instead of memorization, education should be a conversation where students and teachers learn from each other. Next, let's talk about Michael Apple, an education scholar who builds on Gramsci's ideas. Apple believed that education is deeply connected to issues of power and inequality. In his book, Education and Power, he argued that schools don't just pass on knowledge, they reflect and reproduce the power structures of society.
Now, the task of dealing with sets of meanings in schools has traditionally fallen upon people like us, the curriculum specialists, etc. Historically, however, this concern for meanings in schools by curriculars has been linked to varied notions
For
of social
Apple,
control.
curriculum is never neutral. It's shaped by political, cultural, and economic forces that favor certain groups over others. The hidden curriculum, or the set of values and norms taught implicitly, reinforces existing inequalities. Apple believed that education could be a site of resistance, but only if we actively challenge these power relations. Finally, there's Bell Hooks, who took critical pedagogy even further by connecting it to race, gender, and feminism.
I think thinking critically is at the heart of anybody transforming their life, and I really believe that a person who thinks critically, who may be extraordinarily disadvantaged materially, can find ways to transform their lives.
Hooks believed that education should be a space for empowerment, where marginalized students, especially women and people of color, can find their voices. She emphasized the importance of engaged pedagogy, where teachers build real relationships with students and encourage them to think critically about the world around them. But critical pedagogy isn't always easy to apply. Many schools follow strict curricula, making it hard for teachers to introduce these ideas. And in some cases, encouraging students to question authority can be seen as a threat by those in power. Still, Giroux and other thinkers show us that education isn't just about learning. It's about transformation.
Now, while there have been global efforts towards making education progressive, the Philippine education system still fails to follow this trend. Policymakers and those in positions of power remain to have education as their least priority. This is because the lack or even total absence of a quality, right, and liberating education in the Philippines ultimately ensures that Filipinos remain more easily controlled, right, less likely to critically question the status quo, and even perpetually become vulnerable to exploitation, which ultimately hinders national development and even perpetuates existing social and economic inequalities. And so, with this in mind, let us look at how Giroux's ideas apply to the issues faced by the PES today. The growing movement to privatize education and viewing it as a good that can be purchased and sold rather than as a basic human right. And so Giroux would argue that doing so compromises access for marginalized groups and even puts financial gain ahead of real education and social advancement in the Philippines, right? And then the second one is the hyper focus on standardization and testing, more on the national achievement test, right? Multiple choice questions, etc. Specific bullet point refers to the strong focus on metrics and standardized testing to gauge academic achievement. And I believe that according to Giroux, this somehow narrows the curriculum, emphasizes rote memorization, and even disregards civic involvement, creativity, and critical thinking.
Education is not just about empowering people. It's not just about the practice of freedom. It's also in some ways about killing the imagination. And
the skilling of teachers. Basically, instead of enabling teachers to be, transformative thinkers, right? Intellectual thinkers who can critically evaluate and modify their instruction to fit the different needs and circumstances of their students. Policies more likely treat them like technicians, providing a prepackaged curriculum purely based on a so-called manual of what should only be learned by the students, right? And then lastly is education for critical and active citizenship. Is this really present in the Philippine education system? Most likely it is not. And so the notion that education should equip students to be critical and engaged citizens who can confront injustices, challenge prevailing beliefs, and take part in democratic processes is a fundamental component of Giroux's work. And teachers are encouraged by Giroux's critical pedagogy to assist students in comprehending the underlying causes of these disparities and cultivating the ability to strive for a more equitable and just society. So in this sense, Giroux's critical pedagogy ultimately aims to make teachers transformative intellectuals who can critically analyze while also empowering students to become critical thinkers and active citizens capable of questioning, analyzing, and even acting upon social injustices.
Now, how are marginalized learners and teachers viewed by the dominant class today? In an ideal world, education would be a great equalizer, a bridge toward opportunity and empowerment. But in reality, many Filipino students remain trapped in an unequal and unfair system. Marginalized students, those from indigenous communities, rural villages, or informal urban settlements, are often treated not as learners with potential, but as burdens to be managed, or worse, as invisible. These students usually face multiple layers of disadvantage: geographical isolation, poverty, hunger, and cultural discrimination. And instead of adapting education to meet their realities, the dominant system delivers one-size-fits-all solutions. These learners are expected to perform within a rigid structure designed by and for those in power. Meanwhile, the dominant class invests heavily in elite schools that nurture critical thinking, creativity, and leadership. In these spaces, education is expansive and aspirational. However, for the marginalized, it is often reduced to obedience, memorization, and survival. As Giroux warns, this is not an oversight, it is a form of control. What about the teachers who serve these communities? They are often viewed as mere tools to enforce a standardized curriculum. Instead of being supported as professionals with deep understanding of their students' context and cultures, they are overworked, underpaid, and left out of decision-making processes. Giroux describes this as the deskilling of teachers, transforming educators from reflective professionals into curriculum delivery machines. Giroux challenges us to rethink this narrative. Teachers, especially those working at the margins, hold deep knowledge of their students' lives, yet the system often ignores their insights. When teachers are silenced, schools lose their most powerful agents of change. Despite these challenges, there are glimmers of resistance. Alternative schools rooted in indigenous knowledge, community run learning centers, and critical literacy programs are making space for a different kind of education, one that values identity, culture, and lived experiences. These efforts reflect Giroux's idea of education as a democratic project, where students and teachers co create knowledge and envision a better world together. So, how are marginalized learners and teachers viewed by the dominant class? Too often, as expendable, replaceable, or unimportant. But Giroux urges us to see them differently, not as passive recipients, but as participants in reshaping the world. Their struggles, voices, and perspectives are essential to the fight for a just and equitable education system.
Our education today is at a turning point. It can continue preparing students to follow rules, pass tests, and meet rigid standards, but it can become something far more powerful, a space for critical thought, transformation, and social change. Thinkers like Freire, Apple, and Hooks remind us that education is never neutral. It either supports the status quo or challenges it. In the Philippines, our system often leans toward control. Teachers follow strict curricula, and students don't get a chance to ask the why behind the things that occur around them. In this setup, education becomes a tool for silence instead of liberation. But this doesn't have to be the case. We need to reimagine education not as a checklist of standards to meet, but as a process of awakening, of building awareness. When we shift education to become transformative, empowering, and decolonizing, we begin to unlock its true potential. Students learn not just to answer questions, but to question answers. They begin to see themselves as participants in shaping society, not just preparing to join it. But how? How can we make education transformative, empowering, and decolonizing? Education becomes transformative when it causes individuals to perceive the world not only the way it is, but also the way that it might be. Freire envisioned learning that provokes, questions, and invites reflection to transform students into agents of change. Bell Hooks emphasized that empowerment starts with a sense of connection. When the teacher and students share relationships with care and trust, learning turns personal and political. Students, particularly those of marginalized community, feel heard and seen, developing and fostering genuine empowerment. Decolonizing education involves asking whose knowledge is valued and whose knowledge is ignored. In the Philippines, it is about reclaiming local languages, customs, and histories that have been marginalized, and remembering that education, influenced by colonial forces, tends to disconnect learners from their own identities. Transformative, empowering, and decolonizing education doesn't occur overnight, but it starts when we envision classrooms as places where students discover their voice, their agency, and their place, and contribute to building a fairer and a more inclusive world.